Okay, this is Maureen O'Brien. I am the chair of the Landscape Design Council. The Landscape Design Council is bringing this meeting and lecture to you today. I'd like to welcome everyone. The lecture is Discovering the Boston Harbor Islands. So I'm going to introduce Christopher. Christopher Klein is the author of 4 books, including Boston Harbor Islands, Discovering the City's Hidden Shores, an indispensable guide to all 34 of the islands in Boston Harbor. A frequent contributor to History.com, the website of the History Channel, Christopher has also written for the Boston Globe, the New York Times, National Geographic Traveler, Harvard Magazine, Smithsonian.com, and AmericanHeritage.com. I picked up Christopher's books as I was reviewing some potential purchases for Mass Swartz Library. I'm the library manager there. And I immediately put it on the library's Amazon wish list. And I encourage you to visit that list and maybe consider making a contribution. I found it was far more than a travel guide. It was chock full of historical facts, and it was presented in an engaging manner. I asked him if he would talk to us about this historic landscape of the Boston Harbor Islands that's in our own backyards. And I hope you get inspired to explore the islands soon. Welcome, Christopher.
Thank you, Maureen. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. And thank you for the invitation. It's great to speak to all of you. Glad we got through, I guess, the virtual fire marshal with being a little bit oversubscribed for this, but that's great. That shows the interest that's out there for the Harbor Islands. So what I'm going to do today is 2 things. We'll talk a bit about the history of the Boston Harbor Islands, and then we'll take a nice socially distanced trip out to some of the islands and show you what you'd be able to see out there today. And hopefully we can all be out there again this coming summer. So just to set the landscape, there are 34 islands that comprise the Boston Harbor Islands National Park area. There are actually 4 quote unquote islands that you can drive to. So if you're a landlubber, you can still visit these islands. Deer Island, Nut Island, Webb Memorial State Park, and World's End, through the centuries, landfill, are now connected to the mainland. So those are islands that you can visit any time of year. So 34 different islands. And what I thought was very interesting when I was doing research for this book is that I expected that every island would sort of be the same, but I really found that there were 34 islands with their own 34 individual stories, their own individual characters. And in a way, our book, it's organized island by island. It's more or less a collection of 34 short stories about these islands. But I did find that there are 3 themes that seem to come up time and again when talking about the islands. And the first is that these are Boston's hidden treasures, and we allude to that in calling them the city's hidden shores in the subtitle. And there's really no other city that in America that has this unique resource where you could get onto a ferry boat and in 15-20 minutes be on an undeveloped island surrounded by open skies and open water. And you'll find cities like Seattle that might have islands close to downtown, but those have been turned over to residential development. So it really is a unique resource that we have here in the Boston area. The second theme is that these islands are prisms through which we can view the history of Boston and of America itself. And these islands have had a front row seat to some of the seminal moments in American history. If you go back to even just a few months after the Pilgrims land in Plymouth, Miles Standish leads a trading expedition with the local natives, and he spends a night out on Thompson Island when the Puritans arrive in 1630. It's right by these islands. During King Philip's War in the 1670s was probably the darkest moment for the Boston Harbor Islands when 4 of them were used to intern Native Americans. And then you get into the 1700s and the time of the Revolution, and of course, the Tea Party that happens out in the harbor. We'll talk about some of the Revolutionary War battles actually occur out on the Boston Harbor Islands. And then eventually the British leave Boston. And when they do, these islands are the last piece of the city that they see. And then into the 1800s, you have massive influx of immigration. And these islands are some of the first pieces of soil that many American immigrants set foot upon. You have the great clipper ships that are built in East Boston and then set sail to rule the global trade lanes. And during the time of the Civil War, you have regiments such as the famous 54th Regiment that are training out on these islands. So a lot of what we're going to talk about are some of these big moments in American history. And then the third theme is that Boston would not be the city that it is today without these islands. And in 1630, when the Puritans arrived, these islands looked very different than they do today. They were heavily wooded, and then they were used to literally build John Winthrop's city upon a hill. So the timber was harvested from these islands, was used to build wharves and houses. Stone was taken for the streets. And these islands then were converted over to farmland that were used to grow crops and graze livestock that were used to feed the growing city. And then in a more figurative sense, as you can sort of see from this map, these islands form a natural breakwater to reduce the storms from the Atlantic. And they are also used to defend the city of Boston from enemy attack with fortifications going up on a lot of these islands. So let's set sail. Let's do a voyage out to the Harbor Islands, take a look through some of its history. And I'm going to talk about some of the primary methods, the primary ways that these islands have been used for not just centuries, but also for thousands of years by residents in the Boston area. And really, the primary use of the Harbor Islands over the last 400 years has been for the military defense of the city of Boston. So the first fortification goes up in 1634 on Castle Island, back in the days when Castle Island really was an island about a mile offshore. And in one form or another, the islands were used for fortifications right up through the Second World War. And even into the Cold War, there were Nike missile silos that were out on Long Island and in what is now Webb Memorial State Park. So there's this long tradition of the military use of the islands. And one of the stories that we tell about military engagement is a little known event called the Grape Island Alarm. And so we all learned in our history books when we were kids about the battles at Lexington and Concord in April of 1775, and then the Battle of Bunker Hill in June of 1775. But we didn't really learn too much about what was going on in those months in between. And a lot of the action was actually going on out on the Boston Harbor Islands. And there was some significant activity out there in the spring and summer of 1775. And it is on one of these islands, Grape Island, right off of the coast of Weymouth, that we have one of these events on May 21st, 1775. So at that time, Grape Island is owned by a loyalist named Elijah Leavitt, who lived in Hingham. And the British are holed up in Boston. They are under siege. They can't get out by land, but they are still able to move their ships around the harbor. And as I mentioned, during the colonial period, the Harbor Islands are home to farms. So they're very important strategic targets. So Leavitt gets word back to the British in Boston that they're welcome to come to his farm and get whatever supplies that they may need. So on the morning of May 21st, 1775, 4 British ships set sail for Grape Island. And of course, at this time, really the way that news travels is going to be by word of mouth. And if you ever played the telephone game when you were a kid, you know that transferring news mouth to mouth isn't always you don't always get the most reliable news on the end of that conversation. And indeed, that's what happens on this day, because an alarm goes off on the South Shore that a full-scale invasion is coming from the British troops. And we know that because we have one of these accounts from this woman, Abigail Adams. And if any of you are familiar with the Adamses or maybe read David McCullough's biography of John Adams, you know that John and Abigail were very dedicated letter writers to each other. And in May of 1775, Abigail's at the Saltbox home of the Adamses in what is Quincy today. John is with the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. So Abigail Adams writes this to John on the morning of May 21st, 1775. When I rose about 6 o'clock, I was told that the drums had been some time beating and that 3 alarm guns were fired. That Weymouth bell had been ringing. I immediately sent off an express to know the occasion and found the whole town in confusion. The report were that 300 British had landed and were upon their march into town. The alarm flew like lightning, and men from all parts came flocking down until 2,000 were collected. You asked of me who were at the engagement at Grape Island. I may say with truth that all Weymouth, Braintree, Hingham, all who were able to bear arms, and hundreds from other towns within 20, 30, and 40 miles of Weymouth were there. So the good news for the Patriots when they show up at the shore is that there is not a full-scale invasion that's going on. Bad news is the tide's out. They can't launch their boats. Their guns aren't powerful enough to reach the island. So they have to wait about an hour until they're able to get their boats into the water. And as soon as they do, the British hightail it back to Boston with about 4 tons of hay. The colonists set fire to Elijah Levitt's barn. They take off his livestock. And then they're ready to get their revenge against Elijah Levitt for being a turncoat for the Redcoats. So word gets back to Elijah at his home in Hingham that he's got an angry mob of patriots heading his way. And according to the Hingham town folklore, he's ready for them, but not with a gun, not with any rifles. He instead puts out a spread of cheese and crackers, cake, and a barrel of rum. And there are no reports of any gunshots being fired at the Levitt estates that afternoon. So apparently the refreshments did their trick, and that was the end of the Grape Island alarm. Now, if you go out to Grape Island today, you're not going to see any signs of what happened out there in 1775. In fact, you're going to find little evidence of any human activity out on the islands. And it really is probably the one island where you're going to get the most bucolic experience if you travel out there. It's really a foundation of an old farm that was out there. And that's really about all you're going to see. You really will feel like that at times when you're walking along the trails that you might be in the backwoods of New England, surrounded by trees and berry bushes, plenty of wildlife that you'd find out there when you're walking along the trails. And then all of a sudden you might have a view out on the harbor and see a tanker going by in the city skyline and realize that you're right in the middle of an urban center. But it really is one island that you can get to for the most bucolic experience. There are public ferries that go there during the summer. And it is one of 4 islands that you can actually camp overnight at. Grape Island, Bumpkin Island, Pettick's Island, and Lovell's Island are the 4 islands on which you can camp overnight. Now, the island is probably best known for its military connection is George's Island. And George's Island is one of the 2 main, they call them hub islands that get the most visitors, George's Island being one, Spectacle Island being the other. It's about a 30-minute ferry ride from Long Wharf Marriott in the North End. And if you go there today, you will see that brick building used to store underwater mines that were placed on Boston Harbor during the 2 world wars. It has now been converted into a museum and a visitor center. To the left of it is an open air pavilion with a snack bar. So it's a place where you can get lunch, have a drink. It's nice because you can have the shade, but then there's also open views right back to the Harbor Islands and the city of Boston itself. And then you might see behind that pavilion is the outer walls of Fort Warren. And that is what gives George's Island its fame. Fort Warren was in active duty from the Civil War through the Second World War. Never fired any gunshots at any enemy combatants. Its primary claim to fame is that during the Civil War, it was used to house Confederate prisoners of war. And among the most notable were Alexander Hamilton Stevens, who was the vice president of the Confederacy. And if you remember the names Mason and Slidell from the Trent Affair, those 2 Confederate diplomats were also housed at Fort Warren. Now, if you go into the fort today, it's pretty stripped down. Really, all that's remaining in there are just the guts of the fort. A lot of archways, a lot of bare walls. If you're a photographer, you'll get a lot of interesting shots. There was a lot of interesting interplays with lights and archways. It's a place that on a very hot day, it's very refreshing to go inside because it's very cool in there, very dark. But that also means that when the day starts to grow long, along with the shadows and the sun starts to set and the people start to leave, it can be a bit of a spooky place to visit as well, which explains why Fort Warren is home to the resident ghost of the Boston Harbor Islands, the Lady in Black. And this, the story of the Lady in Black was made popular by the historian Edward Rose Snow. And the basic story goes like this, that there was a Confederate soldier who was taken captive on the battlefields down south and was incarcerated in Fort Warren. And he managed to get word to his newlywed wife that he would like to be rescued. So she made her way up north and got to the South Shore, and one night dressed up in men's clothing, dark men's clothing, and tried to be inconspicuous, brandished a pistol underneath her belt, and then set out in a rowboat for George's Island. She managed to land on the island, managed to get inside the fort, and managed to meet up with her husband. Bad news is at the same time that she met up with her husband, she also met up with Union soldiers and the commander of the fort, Colonel Justin Dimmick. So taking the pistol out from her belt, the Lady in Black fired the pistol at Colonel Dimmick. Unfortunately, the pistol misfired and accidentally killed her husband instead. And to make a bad day even worse, she has committed an act of treason against the American government and was immediately condemned to go to the gallows. She had one wish before dying, however, and that's because she was dressed in men's clothing. She wanted to be dressed properly in women's clothing. But this is a Union fort during the Civil War. There are no women who were out there. So the best they could do was they took some of the black drapes from one of the windows, and the Lady in Black wore that to her death and has been haunting Fort Warren ever since. Now, we never like to have history get in the way of a good ghost story, but there's no evidence of any executions of Confederates or Confederate sympathizers out of Fort Warren. Interestingly, there were 2 executions out there, but they were of Union soldiers. These were bounty jumpers who would sign up for a regiment, get their pay, go AWOL, sign up for another regiment, get their pay, go AWOL again. They were court-martialed out on Fort Warren, convicted, and then were executed by a firing squad. So those are the only 2 executions that we know of. But in history's favor, I did come across a news report from a Gloucester newspaper from 1863 that said that the soldiers out on Fort Warren were seeing ghostly apparitions out on their nighttime walk. So definitely pay a visit out to Fort Warren, and you never know who you might run into out there. So the life for the prisoners out on Fort Warren was not terribly difficult in what we know of in the modern sense of being a POW. This was not like the Hanoi Hilton. This was not like other Civil War POW camps like Andersonville or other ones that were run by the Union. Conditions were pretty benign for the Southern prisoners who were there. So if you were an officer or a wealthy prisoner, you could arrange for your own food, liquor, and newspapers to be delivered to you each day from Boston. You were free to go out, gather in groups, have a smoke, walk along the ramparts. In fact, conditions got to be a little too benign to the liking of Union veterans who started coming back from the battlefields down south. And as the war progressed, some of these regulations were tightened on the conditions, but never that bad. They have a very interesting display in the museum, if you go there, that has a dining room table that is set up, and you can see what each person inside Fort Warren was eating during the Civil War. And you will find that many Confederate prisoners of war were actually having better meals than the typical Union privates who were stationed inside Fort Warren. Now, the second primary use of these islands has been in terms of navigational aids. So if you think that driving around Boston's a hair-raising experience, you should have been a ship captain trying to get into the city in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. You not only had to navigate these 34 islands, you had hidden shoals, you had strange currents. You might be arriving in the wintertime and you have ice that's forming on your masts. And then to top it all off, there's only one way in and out of Boston Harbor, and that's a channel that's about 200 yards wide, which is appropriately called the Narrows, between George's Island and Lovell's Island. And it was figuratively like trying to thread the eye of a needle. And not surprisingly, a lot of ship captains missed. So Lovell's Island was home to a lot of shipwrecks, as were a lot of the other islands. And this really endangered the economic lifeblood of the city. So very early on, the merchants of Boston placed lighthouses and navigational aids out on the islands. There were huts of refuge that were placed on Lovell's Island and a few other islands, just shacks with some basic supplies, so if anyone wrecked overnight, they could survive. And this was done in the 1780s and was the forerunner of the United States Coast Guard system. The most notable beacon that's out there is the one you're looking at here. This is Boston Light out on Little Brewster Island. It was originally built in 1716 and was funded by the merchants of Boston. Hopefully it will be open for tours again pretty soon. It's a 1-acre island. When you're able to visit the island, you are oftentimes greeted by the current resident lightkeeper of Boston Light. It's our first woman lightkeeper in 300 years, Sally Snowman, and Sally will oftentimes be dressed in colonial garb and wave a handkerchief as the ships are coming in. You're free to then walk along the 1-acre island and climb the 76 spiral steps and 2 ladders to the top of Boston Light for a spectacular view of Boston Harbor. The structure you see on the left there is the lightkeeper's house. And we don't often think of lighthouses as technological marvels, but when Boston Light was first built in 1716, it's the first lighthouse in the Western Hemisphere. It's going to be about 50 years before another lighthouse is built in the United States. So it's a remarkable piece of history, and it's because of that that it is the last lighthouse in the Coast Guard system that has an actual resident lightkeeper on the island. So I want to take a look at Boston Light as it looks today. And now I'm going to show you an illustration from colonial times, and you'll see that it looked a little bit different. And that's because of what happened during the course of the American Revolution. So Little Brewster Island and Boston Light were in the hands of the British, even after the battles at Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill. It's a very strategic target, obviously. So on July 20th, 1775, the Patriots launched a nighttime raid from the South Shore. There are gunshots that are fired. There are a few casualties. The Patriots burned down some of the wooden structure of the lighthouse. But at the end of the battle, it's still in British hands. The next day, the British immediately send for workers from Boston to come out to start doing repair work. While they're in the midst of doing the repair work, 11 days later, Patriots strike again. More gunshots, more deaths. The Patriots burn down a little bit more of the lighthouse, but it is still standing after this battle. And it will be until the British finally evacuate Boston in the spring of 1776. And as their parting gift to the citizens of Boston, they light a charge and they blow up what is left of Boston Light. So that's the end of the original structure. So the lighthouse that's out there today was built in the 1780s under the orders of General John Hancock. It's because that is no longer the oldest lighthouse structure in the country, but it still remains the designation of being the oldest light station in the Coast Guard system, and it's the reason why we still have a resident lightkeeper out there today. So the Boston Harbor Islands are really the front door into Boston. It's oftentimes for travelers the first piece of Boston you see. Even if today, if you're flying into Logan Airport, you look out the window, the islands are oftentimes the first piece of home to greet you. And really until the building of the railroads, a lot of people coming into Boston are coming in by sea. So the Harbor Islands really are the first piece of Boston they're going to see. And then for immigrants, it's going to be the first piece of America that they see. And these islands really have a strong connection to the immigrant experience. So the biggest threat to Boston for hundreds of years wasn't just an attack by a foreign enemy. It was also the bringing in of a disease from a foreign port, something that unfortunately I've been far too familiar with here in the last year. But back then, we're talking about yellow fever and cholera and smallpox. These were the threats to the city of Boston. So when ships would come in from a foreign port, doctors would go aboard, see if there were any contagious diseases, and if there were, they would take any infected patients and bring them to quarantine stations that were placed out on the Boston Harbor Island. So the first quarantine station goes out on Spectacle Island in 1717, and there's one in constant operation out on the islands until the early 1900s out on Gallops Island. So when Irish immigration really starts to take off in the 1840s after the failure of the potato crop in Ireland, you have tens of thousands of Irish who are coming into Boston. Many of them were impoverished. Many of them were, of course, suffering from hunger and disease. And they quickly overran the capacity of the existing quarantine station on Rainsford Island. So they needed to build a new quarantine station out on Deer Island. And for 800 of the Irish, unfortunately, Deer Island's going to be the first and last piece of American soil that they set foot upon because they passed away there from their diseases. And it's for that reason, just in the last couple of years, there's been a memorial placed out on Deer Island to those Irish immigrants who passed away on Deer Island. It's this Celtic cross, sort of looking longingly out on the city where these Irish had intended to start their new lives in America. And inscribed on that Celtic cross is this inscription: "For dreams of better life to the shores of our destiny was worth the sacrifice for those that follow." And it's because of this immigrant connection that leads to one of these what-if moments in American history, and that has to deal with the Statue of Liberty. So in the 1870s, the French sculptor Bartholdi comes to the east coast of America and starts to scout out different locations that could possibly be placed for the Statue of Liberty. Now, we all know here in Boston that he made an awful mistake and chose New York City to be the location of his statue. But it came with a stipulation. France would give New York the statue, but the New Yorkers would have to build a pedestal to put it upon. So years go by and years go by, and the pedestal is still not built. And by the early 1880s, a group of Bostonians say, well, if New York isn't going to build it, we certainly will here in Boston, because we all know Boston has a great reputation for bringing in construction projects on time and on budget, right? So the word gets back to New Yorkers that Boston's making a play for the Statue of Liberty. Well, they're all up in arms that Boston would deign itself to be nearly as important as they are to have the Statue of Liberty in their city. And very quickly, within 3 years, the money is raised, the pedestal is built, and the Statue of Liberty is unveiled in New York Harbor in 1886. But just imagine what a different landscape would be if you walked down to the shores of Boston Harbor and looked out and saw the Statue of Liberty over one of the Boston Harbor Islands. Now, we don't really think about it too much these days, but the Boston Harbor Islands have been home for people for hundreds and thousands of years in the Boston area. So the oldest artifacts that have been found out on the Harbor Islands date back 5,000 to 6,000 years. And it's thought that the first Native Americans started living seasonally on the Harbor Islands about 8,000 years ago. They would live there in the summertime. They would do some light agriculture. They would harvest shellfish and also fish from its shores. And when the Europeans started arriving about 400 years ago, they start using it in very much the same way with those farms, and there's some fishermen shacks that are built out there. But during the Gilded Age, there's actually several fine mansions that are constructed out on the Harbor Islands, and the grandest of them all was built by Julia Arthur, who was a Shakespearean actress, a queen of American stage, and her husband, Benjamin Chaney Jr. Now, Benjamin Chaney Jr. is the son of Benjamin Chaney, the wealthy businessman who owned Elm Bank Reservation, now home to the Massachusetts Horticultural Society. So there's that connection there. Cheney used the family fortune to build a fine 20-room mansion called the Moorings out on Calf Island that opened in 1902. It had 6 guest rooms, took 8 servants to keep it up. You can see on the right-hand side of this picture is a gazebo overlooking a dock and looking back towards the city of Boston. And the Cheneys spent many happy summers out there. Julia Arthur retired from the stage, lived out her dream to just spend relaxing days out on Boston Harbor Island. And then around 1915, the Cheneys all of a sudden shocked Boston and declared bankruptcy. Their possessions go up for auction. The Moorings is vacated. It's eventually taken over by eminent domain by use of the federal government when World War I starts. And unfortunately, it falls into disrepair and suffers the fate of a number of structures out on the Harbor Islands, is that it is claimed by fire. And if you go out to Calf Island today, all you're really going to see is the foundation. And as you see on the right side here, chimney. This is one of the 3 chimneys from the Moorings. It was from Benjamin Cheney's billiard room, which you see on the left. And you can barely make it out in that old time photo. There's a circle of white stones that's inlaid, and there's also then in white stones the initials BP for Benjamin P. Cheney. And if you go up to that chimney today, you will still see those remnants still there in the chimney. Now, there are people who are still living out on Boston Harbor Island, and that's out on Peddocks Island. Peddocks Island is probably my favorite island to visit because you get 3 different experiences in one. So when you dock, you come up on the old fort that was put in place during the Spanish-American War and was in operation until World War II. And there is a chapel that's there. You can see in that middle picture that was in use when there was an active Army base there. If you walked into the middle of the island, you're going to go through the summer cottage colony. I should also point out that the fort has also been converted part of it into a campground. And you see on the left there, that is a yurt. So if you're not into pitching your own tent and you like some electricity with your camping, some of the finer amenities, then camping out at Peddocks Island is for you in one of these yurts. Back to the middle part of the island is where you'll find a summer cottage colony. And then on the far end, on the far right, very undeveloped, very bucolic, very natural environment to wander on the paths of the island. But back to that summer cottage colony that you'll find in the middle of the island has a very rich history. So it dates back to the 1880s when a group of Portuguese lobstermen who lived out on Long Island were kicked off their land when it was taken over by eminent domain to build a hotel. And rather than rebuild on another one of the islands, they actually took their cottages and they floated them across Boston Harbor and they landed them on Peddocks Island and started this summer cottage colony, which was really thriving in the early 1900s. There were probably a few hundred people who were living out there during the summertime. There were 2 island hotels that were out there. And it was a great place if you wanted to engage in any sort of nefarious activity in Boston. So there were regularly parties being thrown into hotels. There were police raids in which opium was seized. During Prohibition, it was a great place to get any sort of moonshine that you wanted. Rum runners would hang out in its coves. So a very rich history that dates back more than a century. And now today, there are probably about a couple dozen cottages that are still left. So the Commonwealth of Massachusetts took over the island in the 1970s. They thought having private cottages on public land was at cross purposes. So they reached an agreement where the people who were living in the cottages could stay there, but they could no longer pass along their deed to the cottage to anyone else or their next of kin if they passed away. So as the years have gone by, some of these cottages have fallen into the Commonwealth's hands, and the Commonwealth doesn't have the money to do proper upkeep, so they've had to be torn down. Hopefully there's some way to preserve these cottages, because it's a reminder not just are these great moments in American history that have happened out there, but there's a lot of personal history that's happened out there as well. We tell the stories of some of the residents of Pettit Island in our book. So it'd be great if we could preserve some of these cottages in a way for other people to enjoy and also learn about this interesting history. The second of these two hub islands along with George Island is Spectacle Island. And this is again, along George Island, the most frequently visited island. You can get there in about 20-minute ferry ride from the north end. It's a remarkable story of rebirth because for centuries, Spectacle Island was used for uses from a horse rendering factory to a city landfill. And you had these stories that are likely urban legend about the city landfill that was out there in the early 1900s. One was that one day a bulldozer was out there moving around the garbage, but there was just so much of it that the bulldozer actually started to slowly sink into the trash and was eventually all swallowed up inside. Another was that ship captains on a foggy day could still tell their way into Boston by determining which direction the stench was coming from Spectacle Island. So you had this real environmental problem of what to do with Spectacle Island at the same time that you had another problem that arose in the 1980s with the Big Dig. And that was, what are you going to do with everything that you're digging up? Well, they solved two problems at once. So they took all the muck that they dug up to build the Ted Williams Tunnel, they took it out by barge to Spectacle Island, buried over the landfill, and completely resculpted the island. They raised the north drumlin of Spectacle Island, doubled it, basically doubled it in size. So now it's 157 feet tall. And you see this photo in the lower left-hand corner is from that vista. And it's probably the best view of Boston that you're going to have. You feel like you can just reach out and pluck the buildings from the skyline. If you go out there today, you're also going to find a swimming beach that has a lifeguard that's out there. And then if you wander along its shores, you will just see all this sea glass and other pieces of Boston history that are dredged up by the tide. You will find pipe stems or Civil War era belt buckles, all this shattered china from a time when people would just throw their garbage out there in the harbor, and it still is out there and gets churned up and washed ashore. So it's really interesting, all the history that you will find out there. Now you might recognize this figure on the left. That's Frederick Law Olmsted. And he has a connection to the Boston Harbor Islands. So when he comes to the Boston area, he wasn't very impressed with the appearance of the Boston Harbor Islands. As I had mentioned, they had been completely deforested after the arrival of the Europeans, looked nothing like their original ecology. And Olmsted described them as artificially bald, as opposed to naturally bald, I guess, like Olmsted himself. Artificially bald, raw, bleak, prosaic, inhospitable. And he wrote that long ago they were despoiled for petty private gains. So Olmsted developed a plan to return the islands to their original vegetative state. Not only would they make them more pleasing to the eye, but he thought that they would also prevent their further erosion into the sea, a problem with that we can sort of connect with rising sea levels today. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. So he thought it was a way to actually keep these islands intact and preserve them as those natural breakwaters that they're intended to be to protect Boston Harbor. So he comes up with a formal report that he gives to the Boston Park Commissioners to plant native trees such as pine, birch, and oak. It's going to be a 6-year project. It's going to cost $30,000. The commissioners dismiss it out of hand. They don't want to spend the money. So his plan was dead on arrival there. However, he was able to carry out a piece of his plan on 2 islands in Hingham Harbor, which you can see here on the right. So these 2 islands here, sort of in the upper right, Sarah and Langley Islands, were owned by a man named John Brewer. John Brewer commissioned Frederick Law Olmsted to come up with a plan for his piece of property that is World's End today. Brewer also owned those islands, and on those islands, If you go there today, you will still see some of the reforestation that was in Olmsted's plan. So you will see some of those maples, oaks, elms, and cedars out there today. Now, on the east side of Hingham Harbor is World's End. That is now a trustees reservation property. At one time, they were islands, but they are now been connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway. And when John Brewer owned this property, he wanted Olmsted to come up with a development plan in case Brewer ever ran into any financial difficulty. He could sell the land for a residential property. So we think of Olmsted as this park developer, but he was also interested in suburban development as well. So he drew up this plan for World's End with 160 plots to build 163 houses. And, he really was an advocate of planned suburban communities. Now, luckily, this was an emergency plan for Brewer to put into place if he had to. He never had to. So there was never any residential development that occurred out there on World's End. But Olmsted's curvilinear roads were built along with, and trees planted along the side of them to his plan. So if you go out there today, you can wander along the paths, go along these carriage paths that Olmsted had designed, and see these trees that he had planted out there. So these roads are flanked by English oaks, Norway maples, and American elms. Now, it can be a little bit strange. You're walking on these roads that literally now just lead to nowhere. They're these loops, but you can spend a whole afternoon out there on World's End just seeing this landscape that now has these open meadows that are out there, but then these historical remnants of Frederick Law Olmsted as well. So I'm going to close here with this photo here. This is of Nix's mate. It's a symbol of a group called the Friends of the Boston Harbor Islands, which is a great volunteer organization that's been around for 40 years, helping to preserve the islands. Now, when the Puritans arrived in 1630, Nix's Mate is a 12-acre island and was used to graze sheep. But over the years, the rocks along its shores that protected the island were sold as ballast to ships that were leaving port. And this caused the island to slowly melt away, acre by acre, into Boston Harbor, so that by 1805, all that's left in Nix's Mate are these shoals that you'll see at low tide. It required then this beacon to be built to be a warning to mariners at high tide that there are low shoals there and to stay away. But I think it's a reminder to us that these islands are not eternal. They are under different threats, and one of them is the rising level of Boston Harbor. So part of what I hope to do today is not only encourage you to this summer, hopefully if we can get back to normal with visiting these islands, but also to be stewards of these islands and make sure that they're there for generations to come. Because as I mentioned on the top, there really is nothing else like it that any major city has, with these untouched, undeveloped islands so close to downtown. So I hope if you've enjoyed these stories from history, that I'd also encourage you to visit my website, christopherklein.com. You can find links to other books that I've written, other history stories that I've written about for the History Channel. And there's a button in the upper left-hand corner there where you can sign up for my free monthly history e-newsletter with different stories from history. So I encourage you to do that. And I guess let's see if there are any questions that are out there.
Thank you, Chris. That was excellent.